welcome everyone to our CPCT research seminar. Just as a little preamble, we have this kind of webinar setting. We are recording this research seminar to put later on our YouTube channel, which you find under the CPCT name. And maybe Chris or someone could put the link later in the chat as well. We run these research seminars every year, and we always have a kind of specific theme. This year, the theme is what is global critical theory? And I'm very, very pleased to welcome Nick Nesbitt to today's seminar. Nick is professor at Princeton University in the Department of French and Italian, and works across, and I'm sure he doesn't really need an introduction, but we always do it, across Haitian, French, Caribbean, and African studies, post-colonial and critical theory, Marxism, specifically Althusserianism, and these questions of capitalism and slavery that are at the focus of today's seminar. Nick recently published a book that speaks very much to today's topic that's called The Price of Slavery, Capitalism and Revolution in the Caribbean, which was published with University of Virginia Press in 2022. Along that is a long list of monographs. I think I'll pick out the one that introduced me to Nick's work, which was the book from 2008, Universal Emancipation, the Haitian Revolution and the Radical Enlightenment. And in fact, I think, Alberto, it was your copy that you lent me initially. And alongside, and I think this question of universal emancipation, again, is very central to the most recent book. And I'm kind of very interested in the kind of continued work that you've done around these questions and those concepts. Then there are works around, for example, from 2013, the book Caribbean Critique, Antillean Critical Theory from Toussaint to Glissant. And Nick is also, these are just a few monographs, there are further ones, and he's also edited a number of books. For example, in 2017, the book The Concept in Crisis, Reading Capital Today. And again, I'm quite impressed how in the most recent book, you kind of really draw all these angles together around these questions of value form, theory, Marxism, and then kind of the question of the Haitian Revolution, the questions of capitalism and slavery. So thank you so much for speaking to us today. Nick will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time, around the same amount, for Q&A. And as I said earlier, for those who just joined us, you can then raise your hand. We'll unmute, you can turn on the video, and we can have a proper conversation. But also, if you want to write down your questions while the talk is ongoing, there is a Q&A field, so you can also write down your questions as we go, and then we can address them later. And now I'll hand over to Nick.
Great, thank you, Svenja. Thank you for your generous introduction, and to Goldsmiths and Alberto, Julia, Chris, Peter, I see is here too. I'm very happy, honored to be here as part of this distinguished series, and glad to speak about this latest book project that I have. And so, as you say, I'll speak maybe 45 minutes or so and try to introduce some of the themes, some of the problems, some of the approaches that I'm taking to this, and just sort of jump in, and then, you know, in discussion we can go down whatever path or rabbit hole people might be interested in. So let me try to see if I can share my screen, and we've got a couple of images here. And if I, let's see if I can start this, play it. There. Does that look good? See it? Okay, super. Great. Okay, so this book, The Price of Slavery, it is, I think I wrote it quickly for me. I don't know how long, maybe 2 or 3 years from start to finish, and I was very worked up about this issue of what is capitalist slavery, what is the nature of slavery within capitalism as a social form, that is within Marx's capacious, extensive, complex understanding of the nature of the capitalist social form across the 3-4 plus volumes of Capital, the draft, the notes, all those transformations. Can we distill out of that theoretical apparatus the architecture of Capital, the book project, the unfinished project, a notion, a concept of capitalist slavery, which is to say, on the one hand, of course, Marx has plenty of things to say about slavery across decades of work and thousands of pages of writing. And so there's no shortage of comments on slavery. And in my view, in reading through a lot of the secondary literature on the problem, many people have tended, that is Marxists, people writing about Marx and slavery, have tended to sort of pick whatever quote here or there on the Civil War or on American slavery or on slavery as such or Roman slavery, et cetera, whatever suited their argument. And one of the things I wanted to do was to take a different approach to that one and see if within the logical argument, the demonstration that Marx constructs of the nature of the capitalist social form, in which slavery plays a very, well, nominally a very secondary, minor role, but I think maybe we'll get to this. There are a few crucial moments in his argument where slavery is not a historical example, but it's a theoretical crux and in the passage of his that allows for him to develop his argument. So I wanted to see if I could construct in a rigorous fashion out of a relative silence on the nature of slavery within capitalism and the capitalist social form, if I could nonetheless construct, following Marx's argument, what would be the place of slavery as we understand it within capitalism. And so that's thus the title of my talk, Capitalist Slavery. And so already that object, that concept is maybe strange, capitalist slavery, right? Because we have at least within the Marxist tradition, we have this tendency to think of things in terms of modes of production, right? And in that view, think of somebody like Eugene Genovese, right? So in that view, slavery would be a prior mode of production to capitalism, something like feudalism, and then within that analysis, there would be a single distinguishing criterion: wage labor, the sale of labor power. Is that commodity being sold? No, we're in something else, say feudalism, slavery, some other mode of production. Yes, wage labor, labor power is being sold and deployed. Then we are in the capitalist social mode of production. And instead, I think that historically, that poses a problem because of, if we think of just this historical phenomenon that's been referred to as the second slavery, right after the age of revolutions in the 1790s, and the French Revolution, the Jacobin Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, 1804, in particular, that age of revolution brought not a diminishing of global slavery, of Atlantic slavery, but its increase through the 19th century and in the first half and beyond of the 19th century. And so that historical fact led me to ask the question, then how do we understand theoretically the contribution of capitalism, of slavery within capitalism, if it's the case, as I am convinced, trying to read Capital as best and closely as I can, that the labor of slaves can't, by definition, cannot produce surplus value, and yet surplus value is the lifeblood of capital, MCM prime, etc. And yet there was this existence of slavery within, not as an antecedent to the expansion of capital in the 19th century, but along with, concurrent, and in some fashion contributing to that growth of capitalism in the 19th century. So this object, capitalist slavery, was already a problem, and so that's why I wanted to not sort of pick Marx says this, he says that, he says this here or there, but to try to construct some sort of as rigorous a demonstration as I could, which is to say, following the example in particular of the way he lays out his argument so rigorously in the first 6 or 7 chapters of Capital, and the first chapter in particular, let's say the first chapter and chapters 6 and 7, when he talks about surplus value. So that the way that I approach the problem then is an epistemological one. That is, I wanted to approach the problem through thinking about Marx's the rigor, the apodictic nature, as Althusser said in Reading Capital, the apodictic nature, the logically convincing and clear nature of Marx's demonstration. I wanted to emulate that as best I could, and so it's an epistemological problem, but I would say it's a political epistemology. It's also following that Althusserian line. It's something like a theoretical practice was the way I approached the problem, which is to say that obviously the critique of capitalism, the critique of slavery, the critique of slavery within capitalism continues to pose a problem of something like the politics of adequate knowledge, such that we can construct not just a sort of static structure of what that conceptual thing would be, capitalist slavery, but also to point to and indicate some of the limits of that social form. That if we want to think about anything like an anti-capitalist politics, we have to be able to rigorously think the limits of that social form in order to indicate what might be anti-capitalist in fact, right, and what might not be. And so that means, for me anyway, approaching this construction through a sort of theoretical triangulation, which is obviously Marx's Capital in all of its variants and drafts and volumes, etc., but also the reference, the key theoretical reference for me is and has been for quite some time, Reading Capital, and not just Althusser's thought, but very much Pierre Macheret's thought, pointing first of all to that little chapter that he had in the first edition of Capital, where Althusser says right in the beginning, Marx's demonstration is an apodictic one. But then Althusser doesn't really give us any examples of how and why that might be the case. And he sort of leaves that, in my view, to Macheret, who begins, right, that chapter just looks at the first 5 pages of Capital, but it does so in a I think, a really underappreciated and powerful way that is an important predecessor, I think, initiator of a lot of the most compelling, what I see as the most compelling readings of Capital. For example, Michael Heinrich, somebody we don't think of as an Althusserian so much, but I think there are many ways that he is, and I think more specifically, Macheret initiates many of the questions and approaches that we see taken up more recently, even though Macheret hasn't written about Capital since then, really. And of course, back through those figures, Marx as well, back to Spinoza as a constant theoretical reference point for myself. And I just finished a book on Marx, Spinoza, and the Althusserians, where one of the projects in that book is to try to argue for a real theoretical centrality and importance of Spinoza in Marx's work. So that's another rabbit hole. I won't go there for now. And instead, we can already think about and turn to the problem of slavery, capitalist slavery. And in a negative sense, I came to the project because of what I saw in trying to read through a lot of the secondary literature since Eric Williams' great book, Capitalism and Slavery, from 1944, and his dissertation, I think 1941 or 38 before that at Oxford. From this perspective, this reading of Capital that I have been influenced by and trying to pursue myself, which we could summarize as a monetary labor theory of value. Maybe we'll get there in a minute. Immediately, the point being that we have to think about the difference between wealth and value, between profit and surplus value, right? These theoretical distinctions that Marx draws and develops in a very complex way are, they're nowhere to be found, which isn't, you might say, well, that's not fair if these aren't Marxist historians, for example, in this volume that I have here up on the screen right now. But even so, I think the problem is even more. The situation's more dire with contemporary historians of slavery and capitalism, who just sort of brush off the problem of defining their object of investigation, capitalism, and slavery's relation to it. What is capitalism? They sort of, as a whole, throw up their hands and say, "Well, it's too complex. We can't deal with it. We can't get into this. We're just going to dive into the archives. We're going to look at the archives, see what they tell us, and sort of compile and annotate our arguments." And of course, they have plenty of interesting things to say, but without a strong definition of capitalism to begin with, I think that for example, the question of wealth is a trans-historical issue. Okay, slavery may have contributed to the accumulation of wealth, but as we know from reading the first couple of sentences or 2 or 3 paragraphs of the first volume of Capital, wealth is not going to get us very far in analyzing capitalism, right? It's a trans-historical category, and instead, Marx, I think, gives us a very powerful, simple, minimal, initial definition of capital. What is capitalism? In the first sentence of volume 1, right? It's the general accumulation, production and accumulation of commodities, such that capitalism is a society constituted and defined by the general production and accumulation and exchange of commodities. And starting from there, and the cell form, the commodity, et cetera, then the demonstration follows. But I think that's already a strong definition that then he carries through, he follows through step by step. And instead, in this field, really in the larger field of studies of historicist studies of slavery and capitalism since Eric Williams, as I say, there's a tendency just to look at wealth and how much wealth was produced, but that doesn't tell us anything specific about capitalism per se. Well, wealth has been produced by slave labor for millennia. That doesn't tell us much about capitalism per se, unless we can theorize what is the place of slave labor, which by definition, again, cannot produce surplus value. What's its place within capitalism? And then I think, so that's a more general case for historians, not necessarily Marxist historians, but within Marxist historicism as well. I think that there's a general theoretical impoverishment. Let's say there's, for example, you see it in Eric Williams, you see it in other writers who have much to say historically since. But for example, the distinction that Marx draws so carefully between labor and labor power, the commodity labor power, that he says is one of the key theoretical inventions that allowed him to move beyond the impasses and contradictions of classical economics. The invention of the concept of labor power is crucial, and yet there's again and again in this literature. So the first chapter of the book is sort of a literature review and critique, and you see again and again what I'd call a failure to address that, for example, that fundamental distinction between labor and labor power. And so I wanted to approach the problem not as a problem of lived experience. The lived experience of slavery is something that you see, I don't know, I think of the beginning of the Black Jacobins and the way that C.L.R. James presents that lived experience in such a powerful and compelling way. And I think, well, I'll come back to C.L.R. James in a minute. I didn't want to present it as a history. It's not a historiography of capitalist slavery, but it's ideally, or at least what I wanted it to be, was the construction of this concept. What is capitalist slavery? And as I say, it's an argument against this position in traditional Marxism, thinking about things in terms of modes of production, and instead I wanted to think along with Dale Talmage, who I think is one of the, in fact, the best, along with Charlie Post. Their books on capitalism and slavery, I think, are the strongest ones out there. And Dale Talmage's book on Martinique is really just an incredible book, Slavery in the Circuit of Sugar, I think it's called. But I think that even just more generally, the theoretical position of thinking about things in terms of modes of production tends to be, let's just say, wrong-headed from this perspective, which is to say that when you're thinking about modes of production, generally the thought tends to fall back to the 1859 introduction and Asiatic mode and feudalism and capitalism and maybe slavery. And the question is always the how. How are things being produced? And in that perspective, the what is sort of neglected, because you would just think, well, okay, in slavery they were producing, I don't know, armor and swords, and in feudalism and in slavery they're producing sugar, and in industrial capitalism they're producing whatever, steel and iPhones. So that the what is kind of just a encyclopedic compendium of no real interest. But I think that that's not right, because if you think about it, one of the things that capital is trying to show, and one of the ways that it moves so far beyond something like the 1859 introduction, is that simple point, MCM prime, right? Capitalism isn't about producing things, and that distinguishes it from all sorts of other modes of production. Let's say, I would rather say social forms, which is to say that what capitalism produces is not use values. There have to be use values produced, of course, but those are ancillary, those are secondary. What has to be produced is surplus value. And that's something very different. So if you were going to talk about modes of production, you'd have to think about the distinction, I'd say, between other modes of production and this specific one, capitalism, in which what's being produced is surplus value, not the things, the use values that are being produced. So anyway, just to move ahead, then the book is very quickly is structured in these two parts. The first half of it is trying to articulate this theoretical construction of a problem, of a concept, where chapter 1 is this sort of critical literature review of the post-Eric Williams literature on slavery and capitalism. And then the second is where I really try to go step by step to show, to follow Marx's argument, and to think about what is the theoretical place, what would be, if we hold as closely as possible to Marx's concepts and their articulation, how do we place slave labor within that theoretical structure, articulation? And then the second half is, let's call it, some examples, some case studies. I go back to the Black Jacobins and try to think of that book and not as a Marxist humanist project as it was, of course, for James, but to think of it as something like a science of causes. That is to say, a science of the causes of a successful peripheral anti-colonial revolution. Right? James is setting himself this problem in this book, in the year before World Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, in the same year, 1938, the book about African revolts. He's looking around the world and across history, trying to solve a conceptual problem, but also a historical and a political problem. What is the nature of a successful or a failed anti-colonial revolution? And in Black Jacobins, he comes up with this very simple little formula. You need a leader of genius, you need a mass movement, you need an idea, the idea of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, etc. And so I sort of try to work with that. And then I look at Aimé Césaire and his politics. I look at Jacques-Stéphane Alexis, Suzanne Césaire. And that fourth chapter, maybe we can get to in a second, I try to think about the intermediary forms of labor in Haiti between 1791, the first uprising, and Henri Christophe's Code Henri, and how what's the nature of these strange intermediary forms of labor that have some aspects of slavery, some aspects of wage labor. They're just sort of strange beasts, and how can we think about those theoretically? All right, so what is capitalist slavery? I think already simply I already mentioned this definition in the first of Capitalism that takes us a long way. Well, obviously it takes Marx through his whole demonstration of the volumes of Capital, I would say, with various, not just excursions, but also various moments of exteriority impinging on that demonstration. It's not just a purely logical demonstration. Obviously, it's a materialist demonstration, but it's I would call that first sentence axiomatic in its definition of capital. Anyway, but if we look at the second quote, this is maybe the key passage theoretically for me in I think it's in chapter 6 of volume 1, where Marx is making the crucial theoretical distinction between slave labor and wage labor, right? You know the passage, labor power can appear on the market as a commodity only if, and it has to, because that's the only possible source of surplus value is the commodity labor power, if its possessor offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. And in order to do so, of course, that person needs to own themselves in order to be able to, this is something that already Hegel saw, that the person needs to own their own self, be a possessor of their self in order to offer their labor, Hegel might have said, or Marx says labor power more specifically, for sale. Because if not, he'd be selling himself, converting himself from a free man into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity, right? And so for me, that's the sort of crucial theoretical moment that defines for us this distinction between the two, but it doesn't yet answer the question. It tells us negatively, right? What is the place of slavery within capitalism? The slave is the being, the human being who cannot sell his or her labor power, and labor power is the essential commodity. But that it doesn't yet tell us positively what is the place of slavery within the capitalist social form. So that maybe come to in a second, because that's a problem that was a bigger, something harder for me to think through. But in the end, what that what that distinction, I think, gives us from the quote that I just showed a minute ago, is simply that slave labor within capitalism is, in Marx's terms, fixed, constant capital. Simple. It's fixed, constant capital. It's the person of the slave is bought as a commodity and is fixed, not so much physically in place. Fixed capitalism isn't about movement or not. Marx says in I think it's volume 2, but the fact that capital tends to its value tends to be used up and to depreciate, and the value is fixed within that commodity, the slave or whatever else. Here, this is an image from the encyclopedia: the slave, the horse, the mule, water power, wind power, all of these fixed and constant capital, the important criterion being constant, not variable capital, which is to say simply that the slave's labor, because labor power wasn't sold as a commodity, is a constant capital. It cannot, that labor cannot, by definition, by Marx's definition, create surplus value any more than the labor of a mule, the labor of a stream or a river or wind power, whatever it might be. Those are all forms of, well, the mule or the slave are fixed, constant capital. Water, wind power, right, are different, but they're certainly constant means of production. They're means of production, and so then this I mentioned a minute ago, this specific reading way of reading capital that's been very helpful and influential for me, which is to say reading capital as a monetary labor theory of value, which is to say that one of the many things that Marx shows within, really even within the first chapter of Capital in all its complexity, is that in a society, as he's defined it in the first sentence, characterized by the general production, accumulation, exchange of commodities, any commodity to be exchangeable requires a price form, and that price form can't be an occasional one of barter, and this is where this situation in Saint-Domingue in the 1790s is so strange. Sorry, I put my thumb up. I apologize for that. Where former slaves are being paid in sugar, right, or in part of the crop, and in that situation, they would have to exchange that salary, sugar or indigo or whatever it is, coffee, for all of their necessary goods for subsistence. And it's obvious what a sort of strange, hobbled situation that would be when rather a society is characterized by general commodification. Marx shows, among other things, he takes us step by step to the conclusion that there has to be a general equivalent, whatever it is, if it's gold, if it's silver, if it's paper, even if it's a cipher on a screen, there has to be a general equivalent to make that social form functional, right, as through general exchange. And so that was sort of my, and that reading, that way of reading Capital, since people like Moshe Postone and Heinrich I mentioned, and Riccardo Bellafiore, and many others that have been influential to me, Fred Mosley is another one, in thinking about slavery and capitalism. That was my way of trying to address this problem and to try to answer in a compelling way the question of why is it that slaves can't create surplus value, right? They're working, right? And in discussing this with people, readers of other readers of Capital who are convinced that slaves produce surplus value, they say, come on, they're working, they're producing sugar, they're producing profits, they're accumulating wealth, they're doing all of these things. And yet, I think from that definition that Marx has, it's very clear that they cannot be producing surplus value. They cannot. It's just theoretically impossible. And why not? Because their labor has no price form. If we stick with the logic of Marx's demonstration, what's bought and sold is the person, the slave at market, right? And then, as I just said, then that person becomes a means of production, fixed constant capital, who cannot produce surplus value, because among the logic goes, there is no price form for that labor, and for it to be exchangeable as a commodity, for there then to be a possible distinction drawn between necessary and surplus labor, right? Chapter 7 of Capital. There has to be a formal means of determining the price of that, the value of that commodity. It requires a price form. Once I walked into Target and I wanted to get a thermos, and I found the thermos I wanted, and there was no tag on it, and so I said, "Come on, hey, how much is this thermos?" And there were people were sort of hovering around me, and they didn't know what to do, and finally one of them just said, "Just take it, just go," and it had no price form, and so it couldn't be exchangeable as a commodity for money in my pocket, and instead it just didn't function as a commodity in this social form that we live in. And here's a different example, more to the point. This is an 18th century spreadsheet. It's the last spreadsheet sent back from Saint-Domingue to Paris. It's already, I think, 1790 or 1791. So I think it's actually sent back after the Great Uprising on the Northern Plain. So it's already just not worth the paper it's written on, but it's still a beautiful document, and I think it's a very eloquent document in this context, which is to say that it points us to this problem of price in a very visual and determinate fashion. This is one of the frames from that bigger image I just showed. This, you can, if anyone's interested, you can just download this from the John Carter Brown Library. It's online there. And the thing to note here, this is just a sort of summary table of the value, an aperçu of the wealth, the territorial wealth of the French part of Saint-Domingue in that year, 1790, I believe. And so then you have on the left, you have a list of different material categories of that wealth, right? Sugar plantations, white, raw, coffee plantations, cotton plantations, indigo plantations, tanneries. And then you get down toward the end and you see nègre, ancien et nouveau, grand et petit, next, right above chevaux et mulets, horses and mules, and horned beasts, right? And so we see in this context of what I was just saying, you see that Black slaves appear as a category of wealth, and they can appear, if we look not just at the next frame number, the physical number of each of these categories, but their value, right? And then we go to the last frame on the right, the total general value of each category, and slaves can appear as a value because they have a value, because they are exchanged commodities, right? And so that can be quantified, right, as a value, just like sugar plantations and coffee plantations. Whereas the labor of slaves, having no value form, cannot be categorized within the summation of the wealth of the colony. It has no value form, no way of appearing as an exchangeable commodity, right? And so in all of this, I wanted to sort of not move beyond, but to take especially in the second part of the book, I wanted to draw some of the conclusions from this theoretical argument to some of the figures who've been of interest to me along the way, people like C.L.R. James and Aimé Césaire, Suzanne Césaire, and these are figures of course, 20th century Marxist humanism, and I'm approaching this, as I said before, as sort of a Spinozist, I don't know, post-Althusserian, let's just say, and bringing these sort of let's call them structural questions to the problem of capitalist slavery that were questions that C.L.R. James and Césaire weren't asking. But, well, I already gave the example of trying to read the Black Jacobins as a science of causes, so that we could think categorially in something analogous to Marx's categorical explanation of the nature of capital. But within all of that, I mean, it's true for capital as well, I think. I'm also, as a literary scholar as well, I'm also very invested in thinking about the rhetorical power of some of these writers. Why is it that we keep reading the Black Jacobins when there are all these historiographies of the Haitian Revolution since then? Why is it we keep reading Aimé Césaire and what he had to write about Toussaint Louverture or Henri Christophe or etc. And it reminds me, I'm reminded of Spinoza's proposition that I'm just paraphrasing, that the truth unto itself lacks the power to displace the false, right? And that instead we need something more than a true understanding of, say, the nature of the Haitian Revolution, the nature of Haiti as in its historical reality and richness and complexity and inventivity and originality and these things. Sven, you were mentioning that book, Universal Emancipation. If we can accept, as Peter's argued as well, the central, and Alberto, the central place of the Haitian Revolution as at the forefront of the age of revolutions, in its radicality, in its universality, to know that truth, nonetheless, that doesn't displace that all of the false images again and again that the media confronts us with. We need something like Peter's book, Damning the Flood, and we need something like the rhetorical power of the Black Jacobins to actually articulate and give that truth a certain force and power. And I think James is such an extraordinary writer that in his militancy, in his global intervention within the problem of anti-colonialism as a problem in 1938 and in 1963 for the second edition as well. The power of that rhetoric, of his writing, in its force, is something that brings us back to the Black Jacobins again and again. And so, how am I doing for time, Svenja?
6 minutes to 45, but you can also run over a little bit. We are not overly strict.
Okay, well, good enough. Well, I won't. I'll try not to. I want to see where people's interests take us. But let me just mention the point in that second chapter, trying to reconstruct construct the concept of capitalist slavery out of Marx's demonstration. I was saying a minute ago that if we read chapters 6 and 7, let's say 1, 6, and 7, we know that a commodity has to have a value form, it has to have a price form, there has to be a general equivalent. We know that furthermore, in order to produce surplus value, in order to have exchange viable and not simply MCM, we need MCM prime. So the riddle that classical economics couldn't solve, where if two two commodities of equivalent value are exchanged, where does the profit come from? And Marx, he ends chapter 5, right, with that challenge. So how do we think about that? In chapter 6 and 7, make that leap, a theoretical leap, to find the answer in the commodity labor power, right, which we saw a little while ago, is theoretically to be distinguished from slave labor. But that negative definition doesn't tell us, so if slavery was nonetheless expanding in the 19th century, in this second slavery, what's its place within that expansion? And so this is, I have not come upon anyone in this whole literature asking that question in more or less something like that form, or setting it as a problem. So for me, that was where this took me, to this problem. And I tried to construct an answer essentially out of volume 3 of Capital, because in volume 1 and 2, right, Marx is holding the distinction between price and value, profit and surplus value, as theoretically equivalent, knowing all the while that in the empirical complexity of capitalism, they are rarely equivalents. And yet, theoretically, in his abstraction, as he moves to increasing levels of theoretical concretion, he finally gets to the point in volume 3, right, where he can distinguish between the two. And he talks about cost price. He talks about the ways that cost price veils and hides within the capitalist social form the various, not the means of production, but the source of surplus value, where all inputs, right, as the economic jargon has it, all inputs, it's like the economic night where all cows are black. All the inputs go into the outputs, right? And they all look the same in the end. And you just, the price, the cost of the inputs has to be lower than what the product can be exchanged for, and then we can go home with a profit, and that's all we care about. But if we theoretically distinguish between price and value, profit and surplus value, then we can distinguish theoretically between the source of surplus value and other fixed forms of fixed constant capital that aren't producing surplus value. And then Marx gives a series of sort of simple equations we can think about. If we can simply sum the constant and the variable capitals to equal the value of the product, the commodity, and we can imagine 80% constant, 20% variable, 60% constant, 40% variable, etc. And he even flashes for a second this he thinks theoretical we can even imagine zero variable capital and 100% constant capital, but that never happens, he says, and he goes on to other examples. But if we want to think about the theoretical case of slave labor within capitalism, it's precisely that example, right? Because slave, if we imagine theoretically, there may be holding other variables in suspension. If we think about the case of pure slave labor producing a commodity for capitalist exchange on the market, it's going to be zero variable capital, because the slave's labor is a form of constant capital, Marx as he's defined it in chapter 6. And so if that's the case, then what's going on there within the global social form of capitalism, global capital in the 19th century, let's say. And so then the argument that I have there in essence, that I try to develop in some detail, a lot of it draws on Fred Mosley's really, for me, impressive book, Money and Totality, where Mosley shows that Marx is thinking about surplus value not as a summation of individual capitals' possessive surplus values, but rather a total mass of surplus value from which the sale of any commodity at market can capture, if in a successful sale, can potentially capture a portion of that global mass of surplus value. So we're thinking always in capital in theoretical terms. We're not thinking in terms in empiricist terms. Theoretically, then, let's imagine a bag of sugar that is taken to market, and the labor that's constituted, that's gone into the production of that sugar, is 100% slave labor, theoretically. And so no surplus value was created. But in a certain social conjuncture and moment of all of these infinitely complex variables, and again, I should say Dale Talmage's study of the global dynamics of sugar production, slave sugar production, and slavery in the 19th century, from Martinique to a global scale, from a Marxist perspective, is really extraordinary. In this case as well, showing the incredibly complex dynamics of the sugar market in the 19th century. So anyway, if we take that bag of sugar to market, and let's imagine that at one point it has a lower cost price, sale price, than a bag of sugar made from beets in Europe, and so it captures a successful sale, even though there was no surplus value created in producing it. Nonetheless, a successful sale is made, and so the planter who's sold that bag of sugar without producing any surplus value nonetheless captures at market a certain quantum of surplus value from a global mass of surplus value. Whereas in the historical dynamic through the 19th century, beet sugar will come to be more and more mechanized, cheaper to produce. It has a lower cost price than slave-produced cane sugar from the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera. And so that dynamic shifts, and slavery becomes, as Eric Williams first scandalously argued, it's slave labor that becomes economically unviable, and that's what drives the abolitions in the 19th century, et cetera. So we can come back to that if anyone's interested. Let me just finish up. We can talk more about the Haitian Revolution and the various forms of labor, intermediary, the Code Henri and Henri Christophe is fascinating if anybody's interested in that. And Toussaint Louverture, this is Saint-Onax, and Césaire, Jacques-Stéphane Alexis. I'll just move through all of this. We can talk about, I'd love to talk about chapter 11 of Capital and why it proves that Marx was decisively influenced by his reading of Spinoza as a student preparing for his dissertation in 1841. And when he comes to mention Spinoza in Capital in that neglected chapter 11, why chapter 11 is a perfectly Spinozist chapter. And it's not by accident that that's where he mentions Spinoza, but that's, as I say, that's another rabbit hole, but I'm glad to go down there. And I'll just finish by saying that I try to end the book with a celebration of Suzanne Césaire's brilliant work and the genius of her 6 or 7 articles from the journal Tropique in Martinique during the war under Vichy, Le Grand Camouflage being the most extraordinary of those. And there are many, many things to say about Suzanne Césaire, and more is fortunately being said about her, and not just about Aimé Césaire. But what I had to say was really very simple, which was to say that in this pantheon of global South Marxist humanist thinkers and writers, such as Alexis, such as C.L.R. James, such as Aimé Césaire, all of them are calling for industrialization of the South. And Césaire, for example, year after year in the French Assembly, we need to industrialize Martinique. Long after he gets out of the French Communist Party, he's still saying, I'm a Leninist. He's still saying, I represent le proletariat martiniquais, up until even the year 2000. He continues to be a Marxist in a very original, powerful way, a democratic socialist, let's say, elected, showing up at the French Assembly and having his 5 minutes per year to speak. And in those 5 minutes, what he usually most years tends to say is, we need more industrialization of Martinique. We need more jobs. We need more work. We need more factories, etc. At the same time, that in Tropique, not just Toussaint Césaire, but all the writers in Tropique and beyond are very cognizant, very aware of the biosphere, of the ecological catastrophe in its colonialist dimension, and how colonialism, how slavery, how the plantation has led to a systematic degradation of the biosphere, et cetera. All of these problems that are, immediate and obvious and everywhere around us today. In the 1940s, they were very aware of them. What they weren't aware of, except for Toussaint Césaire, is that there might be a contradiction between industrialization in this sort of global Stalinist, or not Stalinist, global Leninist mode, and the degradation of the environment. But Toussaint Césaire, I think, I try to argue, was already aware of that contradiction, and she doesn't buy into the uncritical celebration of industrialization, of work at any cost, as inherently anti-capitalist, etc. And so that was a simple point, but it sort of was a summation of the argument of the book for me, but in no way does it exhaust what we might have to say about Toussaint Césaire's quite amazing work. Okay, so let me just end it at that, and we can take things in any direction people might want to go.
Thank you very much, Nick. There is already one question in the Q&A, which I suppose we could start with and give everyone a little bit of time to think about questions and comments. Nick, so the question from Florence is, thank you very much. Do you talk about slave labor within capitalism in connection with primitive accumulation? I don't know
Great
if that's
question.
an opening question.
Yeah, primitive accumulation. So let's see, how the big question. So here's one way to think about it, and that I do talk about it in the book. If we going back to this question of the limits of capitalism, I was very impressed by Ellen Makeson's Wood's book, The Origin of Capitalism, right? And in that book, that historicist book, right, her problem is to define the sort of the nodal point, the tipping point, the essential point, the limit into capitalism historically, right? She argues that we have to look at food, we have to look at the essential commodities. And so from that perspective, then the historical argument about primitive accumulation is crucial, right? The enclosures, the Scottish enclosures, et cetera, that Marx talks about as the great historical example and case, et cetera. The point being, theoretically, that it is capital, that is to say, in this very minimal but true way, we have a true idea that it is capital if food and other essential necessities are only available to us as commodities, right? If that is the case, we're in not just general commodification, where everything of value tends to be commodified, but the crucial one, she shows, is food, and let's say food and shelter. And if that's the case, think of the enclosures, or think of Haiti and the historical conflict between rural Haitian society and the struggle for autonomous existence and land, le pays en dehors, etc., versus the demand from the elite for the production, already with Toussaint Louverture, the production of export crops, and that struggle, such that the question becomes, can a community exist autonomously relative to its means of subsistence and existence, food, shelter, etc., or is it forced to enter into a monetary economy, that is, go back to the plantation, grow sugar, which is exported, you're paid in sugar, and then you have to exchange that salary for your means of subsistence. You're in an exchange commodity. Well, so the question, that's the historical problem of primitive accumulation. Two examples, the Scottish enclosures and this Haitian case. But I think it's also the ongoing problem of, there it does it again, I don't know how to turn this off, ongoing primitive accumulation, but also, let's say in a sort of Spinozist Althusserian sense, the eternal problem of primitive accumulation, or just the theoretical problem of primitive accumulation, where if we think about food, we can also think about it not simply in a historical mode, looking back at the passage into capitalism, but if we think about the general limits of capitalism as such, in any direction, in any temporal direction, then we can identify food as maybe the weak link in the chain, in the system itself, so that problem of enclosure, the enclosure of food and shelter, and primitive accumulation understood in that sense, relative to enclosure, relative to the commodification of the essential means of existence and reproduction of the working class, becomes one of the, if not the crucial theoretical points to address and to think about.
Now, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, which is amazing, but also means I need to organize a little bit more. I think what we'll do, so first of all, I should have said, if you would like to ask your question live, as in speak, and also maybe turn your video on, I would just suggest please raise your hand and then, or write in the Q&A and say, I'd like to speak. So absolutely, everyone who'd like to speak their question, I will unmute you and promote you. Apparently, I can't myself at the moment type anything into Zoom. It doesn't allow me. I don't know why. So I have to say, which is a bit annoying. But what we'll do is we'll go in the order of the Q&A for now. So we'll take Simon's question first or next. And if you've typed a question but you'd also like to speak, yeah, raise your hands and I'll try and do my best to come to you all. So Simon writes, if slaves are conceptualized as fixed constant capital, as I think you said, where does this leave exploitation? Does it mean that the concept of exploitation, i.e. the performance of unpaid surplus labor, producing a surplus appropriated by a ruling class, cannot be applied to the slave?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, I know Peter is here, and I think Peter, if I'm not off base, has formulated a similar question to me, such that Marx defines exploitation as command over labor. I think I'm recalling that correctly.
Nick, shall we take Peter's question as well? And then would you like to answer both of them together? Yeah,
yeah, sure. It's probably related. Yeah, sure.
Okay. 1 second.
Is that working?
Hi, Peter.
Yeah, we can hear you. And now you should also be able to, if you want, you can put on your video or you can just speak.
I don't see how to do that. I can see how to unmute, but not how to release the video.
Oh, sorry.
Doesn't maybe matter that much.
Okay, yeah, go
Okay.
on.
But I know there's a lot of questions, and thanks so much, Nick. I have a bunch all by myself, and I would love to just ask it in a little bit of detail if that's okay. First to say that I think by emphasizing the question of form, you really do. It allows you to pick out all the things that you have to say about a society, a social form that's shaped through the commodity exchange, things having a price, etc. And that is very illuminating. But I just wonder if it also makes other things obscure. And basically, I have two sort of parts of this question. One's historical, the other's theoretical. And I'm guessing also other people have these same kinds of questions because they're immediately the things that I know you've been confronted with before, and people are always going to throw at you, I imagine. The first, there's two historical questions. One is that question of profits. So Tomic can say in the 1830s and 40s that the profits from sugar can kind of take a cut out of the global market, the sugar beets and things. But is that plausible for the 1760s, 70s, 80s, the period of Saint-Domingue, in other words, Haiti's like massive sugar profits? Can they really be explained in terms of taking a cut out of a bigger market? And then in particular, cotton. I mean, how to explain the massive profits coming out of the cotton belt, particularly in the run-up to the war. So 1860, I think, is the biggest harvest and ever more profitable. And how to really explain that. And it's such an integral part of the whole Industrial Revolution, of course. Well, that's one question. The other is the continuum. And this is a point made very forcefully, as I'm sure you know, by Heidi Gerstenberger and her book that's been translated now into English, Market and Violence, Macht und Gewalt, is really compelling as a kind of actually existing historical capitalism. And what she calls the kind of variably unbounded, expansive exploitation. And what she's able to show quite convincingly historically is that if nothing stops capital from coercing people by all available means, everything on the spectrum from slavery to ersatz slavery to indentured servitude to coolie labor, right through to the Nazi extermination camps, well, capital will do it if nothing stops it. As long as it's profitable, it'll extract unpaid labor by any available means. And so there's no real reason why there would be like such a sharp division if capital is essentially, and this is the definition from chapter 18, volume 1, essentially the command over unpaid labor. In a way, the question of how it extracts that unpaid labor is sort of secondary. And so my second question, the theoretical question, the more important one for this discussion, I know, is that by emphasizing form so much, and that passage from chapter 6 that you quoted, you risk, it seems to me, a bit of a tautology, because when you say that, or when Marx says labor power can appear on the market as a commodity only if ... it appears as a commodity in a way. In other words, you can only sell something if you can sell something, or you can only sell something if it can appear on the market with a price. I mean, that's certainly true. That's kind of unarguable in terms of how, and obviously a slave is not in a position to sell their labor power. So you're clearly right about that. But does that illuminate what capital is doing when it harnesses unpaid labor in the form of slavery? And it seems to me if you were to focus on the content a bit more, then there'd be two propositions you'd have to engage with. One is that question that's already been raised about about primitive accumulation, that the historical preconditions, the separation of workers from their own means of production, right, from their own livelihood or their own land. And that is achieved with slavery because you've stolen these people away from their land. And then the second thing is the establishment of this command over unpaid labor, which is also achieved, obviously, in the form of slave, in a slave plantation. And then you're left with the question of, well, is the slave labor paid by the hour, let's say, rather than in a single lump? And that is a formal difference, it's true, but it doesn't by itself decide the fundamental question, which is, can you extract more out of that slave than you paid for? And that seems to me the key thing. And it seems to me that plantation owners and drivers and all the things you know so much about go to a ton of trouble to get more out of those slaves than they paid for. And Marx himself does concede the point, I think. There's a passage in chapter 10, I'm sure you know about, where he says it's no longer, he's talking about corvée labor, so the chapter on the working day. It's part 2, and I'm not sure if I can paste this in, so if anyone wants to make a note of it, it's page 345 in in Folks's translation. But he says there's a point, where what's at stake here is not just about extracting more use values from your slaves, but rather the production of surplus value itself. And that's because now they are integrated into this capitalist market system, and it's about extracting and pumping every last little bit of surplus value that they can out of them. And I suppose that's the question I have, is that does the formal analysis that you have in terms of the way the commodity form works, does it allow you to engage with the substance of that exploitation? Sorry, and this is Simon's question too, obviously. So I'll stop there. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Great. So as always, Peter, thank you. And thank you to the first question as well, to push me to the limits of what I can think and say. So for the first question, you point back to the 18th century, right? And we think about the enormous profits of Saint-Domingue up till 1789, and how we're to think about that. I guess my answer would be to ask the question, if we understand capitalism in the way that Marx defines it, that I'm arguing he defines it from the beginning of Volume 1 as the generalization of production, exchange, accumulation of commodities, then we would, armed with that theoretical definition and its ramifications, we would ask the historical question then, in Saint-Domingue in the 1760s, was this capitalism, or was it some other social form? And so that's not a satisfactory answer, but nor am I a historian of capitalism. But if I were to go down that road to your question, the same thing with your question about the profits of cotton up till the Civil War, we'd have to look at the general social context, social form in which that production is taking place, and whether it makes sense to understand it as a capitalist one or as something that's in subtraction, where I think a simpler case is this one I pointed to that, Peter, you know so well, of that Carolyn Fick describes, of the Pays en dehors in the 1790s in Haiti, where the rural Haitians exist in subtraction from global capitalism, and they're able to maintain this very different social form up into the 20th century, until Duvalier, etc. And we can see there that, in contrast to the demand for export crops, it's a very different social form. And so there it's a very stark, easy distinction to draw. If we're thinking about Saint-Domingue in the 1760s or cotton in the South in the 1850s, then it's much more complicated. But I would simply, and hopefully this isn't just punting the question, I would just insist that for me, it's always important to move from some sort of production of the concept, some sort of theoretical articulation that then allows us to look at the archives and to see what was going on there. And so, my general hope of taking this, as you say, this formal route, thinking about social form in as rigorously a way as I can, is to construct a concept, right, that hasn't, in my view, hasn't really been theoretically constructed, and that I'm hopefully doing so in a faithful way to Marx's articulation out of that, with Marx and beyond Marx, let's say, that then things can be done with that concept. So I tried a little bit to do some things with it in that second half of the book, but not going too far. But these kinds of questions would take us in that direction. And so then the second point about exploitation, about command over unpaid labor, I would say that on the one hand, it seems perfectly obvious that it's not just the case of the commodity slaves, but any means of production. If a capitalist just purchased a robot or purchased mules or whatever, they're going to try to extract the most production out of that constant capital that they can. There's nothing in particular about slaves other than the specificities of that, the means of extraction, the violence, etc. So the violence done to the wind or the water power doesn't trouble us. That done to mules and human slaves obviously does. But if they are all fixed constant capital, they're all going to be approached in a similar with that similar intention, let's say. And then I would also bring back this point that you've raised, and that the question about exploitation, I think, raised command over unpaid labor. I want to, in thinking about form and theoretically in this way, I want to push us, let's say, if we're those interested in this problem, to think about the specificity of the capitalist social form, because command over unpaid labor is not, it's historically general, right? The pharaohs had command over unpaid labor, right? But that doesn't mean that they were doing so within a capitalist social form. And we could point to all sorts of historical examples of command over unpaid labor, but I don't think it's a sufficient definition to allow us to think about the function of slavery within the capitalist social form. Well, we'll keep talking about it and maybe come back to it. But those are two relatively quick answers. So thank you.
Okay, we have a few more written questions. So I think, should we take a few of the written ones together, maybe, to work our way through those, and then we'll have another round of spoken ones afterwards. So we have a question by Ashwin, writing, "Thank you so much for a terrific talk, and I learned much from your excellent essay, Racial Capitalism and Social Form. I wonder if you can say something about conceptualizing the relationship of various forms of unfree labor, not just slavery, to capitalism. I'm thinking here of indenture, various forms of debt bondage, etc." Am I okay to read out two more? Yeah. So then we have a question by not George, but Fred, appears as George. "I've read your book and I follow the logic of your analysis, but I just balk at the notion that the capital possessed by southern US planters had the highest organic composition, 100%, and hence were capturing surplus value from sectors with lower OC. If that was the case, and again, it is logically plausible in Marxist terms, then how do you account for the fact that the planters never became wealthy in absolute terms and were chronically indebted to northern banks?"
Great question, yeah.
And maybe a third one, and then we'll give you a chance to respond. Question by Yari: "Thank you very much for the great outline of your book and your talk. I'd like to follow Simon and check if you could add a comment about where your conceptualization of slave labor leaves the concept of productive and unproductive labor as we find them in volume 1. Well, yeah, maybe we've talked a little bit about that. Let me just see if we take the next one because it speaks to something a little bit similar. Could you elaborate a bit more on the idea that constant capital C plus variable capital C with V going to 0 gives the slave as a theoretical notion and its connection with capital volume 3?
Yeah. Yeah, those three are sort of a piece. Okay. Yeah. So Ashwin, I think you're referring to a chapter I wrote on the idea of racial capitalism, and there I was trying to sort of extend some of these ideas to the discussion on racial capitalism and to draw them in these similar terms, in these theoretical terms of social form, the problem of surplus value versus profit, these kinds of distinctions that I think, at least in the literature I'm familiar with in the racial capitalism discussion, are often not sufficiently drawn when the argument is a Marxist one that's being made. And simply, it's nice the way you point to other forms of labor, right? Indentured labor, debt bondage. And if we think that I flashed on the screen toward the beginning, the new historians of capitalism, right? And this group of historians has done some really interesting things looking at forms, these sorts of forms of labor in the United States, and mostly in the 19th century, and the extension of indebtedness, debt bondage, these sorts of things you're pointing to, and so I tried to pursue that in that, I think I said, fourth chapter of my book, with the case of this Haitian case, where we see other strange phenomena like slaves who are still legally owned by their slave owner, nominally free, working, selling themselves out to work for a wage, paid in a wage, etc. And so there are all sorts of strange mixed forms like that in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and in the first half of the 19th century, that we find. In what I was looking at in the 1790s, I was just looking at the labor decrees from Saint-Onax, from Toussaint Louverture, from Henri Christophe, the Code Henri. And as you go through those, you see a sort of general shift from former slaves being paid in kind by a portion of the crop that they'd have to use as their general equivalent, to increasingly in the Code Henri, everything is specified in terms of a monetary value that the laborer is going to be paid. And so if you think about that sort of existential problem that Aimé Césaire draws so powerfully in La Tragédie du Roi Christophe, right, of one of the questions of the play is, has Henri Christophe put us back in slavery because he's forcing, by means of violence, he's forcing the former slaves back to the plantation, back to forced labor. They don't possess the freedom to decide whether to work or not, so they can't sell their labor as a commodity. And yet, of course, the ideology of the Haitian Revolution and of Henri Christophe is the universal abolition of slavery. Is it? Isn't it? Right? The question gets thrown around by the workers, by Christophe, etc. Well, so here is sort of, I tried to approach it from this theoretical angle of thinking about these strange mixed forms of labor, where Carolyn Fick looks at them historically, and she just says they're intermediary. But how do we think about that theoretically? So I tried to do that with these theoretical tools that I tried to construct in the first half of the book. And then just to respond quickly to those other three questions, Fred, I'm not, so it's a theoretical construction. We can imagine sugar made by 100% constant capital, 0% variable capital, right? It's a theoretical construct. It's not that I'm historically identifying that in the archives. Maybe it existed as some kind of an anomaly, but if we were to look at the inputs of sugar, production, we would, I think, invariably find that there was some wage labor going into that of the intendant, of the supervisors, of whatever different parts of the plantation and the process. So that image of 100% and 0% is just a purely theoretical construction. Likewise, the distinction between productive and unproductive in the discussion of slavery and capitalism that I was reacting to, there tends to be this general conflation, even on the part of many Marxists, that the slaves produced sugar, which they, of course, did. That use value, that commodity sugar, because they produced it, their labor was productive. But as a concept, that's not what Marx means by productive and unproductive labor in Capital. He means something very, very different, theoretically simple. Productive labor is labor that produces surplus value, and the only commodity capable of producing surplus value is labor power, right? And so it's simply a theoretical distinction. It's not an existential one, or an empirical one. If one works, then one is productive. If one makes sugar, one is productive. So that's something very different than saying the labor produces surplus value. I forgot what the last question was about constant capital and variable capital, but essentially it's the same response, that this is a theoretical example that I try to construct of 100% constant capital, 0% variable capital. It's not an empirical, not an archival example or a case that I'm drawing on.
Thank you. So I thought we had 2 more written questions and 1 hand, which I would have thought maybe we can overrun a tiny bit and take those, especially as people have waited a long time or also written them down. There is now a 3rd question, which I'll read in a moment and then address. So firstly, we'll have Josie, Alicia, and then Steve. So Josie is writing regarding Florence's question, what about enslavement as a form of accumulation by expropriation that enabled the primitive accumulation of capital that kick-started capitalism in its beginning, as some have argued? Then Alicia's question is, hi Nick, thanks for your talk in the book. While reading it, I kept wondering what you make about the argument Sylvia Wynter makes via James about the importance of the Piazza framework in valuing slave labor. There we seem to
Can you repeat that? Sorry, say again.
Oh yeah.
About
the argument that Sylvia Wynter makes via James about the importance of the Piazza framework in valuing slave labor. There we seem to find some form of general equivalent, whereby the lifetime of an adult male slave becomes the norm through which various other forms of life, for example, younger slaves, can be bundled together and valued and then exchanged for various other commodities. And then, Steve, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, is that okay? Can you hear? Thanks, Nick. What troubles me, I guess, is Marx's emphatic statement in the Grundrisse that the plantation owners in the American South are not only appear to be capitalists, but actually are capitalists. And I wonder whether the kind of form analysis, and maybe this picks up on what Peter's saying, whether the form analysis just in the end misleads about actually existing forms of capitalism, and whether that what we end up doing is kind of trying to shoehorn complex social forms into Marx's abstractions. The abstractions are useful. They tell us all manner of things, and we, like all forms of thinking, that you need the abstractions. But that doesn't mean, say, one should actually then kind of overlap them with historical realities. I in some ways, I find it more useful to take Jairus Banerjee's distinction between forms of exploitation or modes of exploitation and modes of production, because it seems to me that one of the implications of the argument that you're advancing is to take us back to some rather odd Stalinist, stagist formulations that just demarcate between modes of production just too neatly. Whereas actually, if we're dealing with the historical complexities of capitalism, one's engaging with all of those mixed forms all of the time. So I just find that the analysis, I guess, just too clear cut in that sense. I mean, for instance, you mentioned that the mixed forms in the Caribbean, but those mixed forms were there in the American South too. So, there were slaves who were involved in industrial production. There were the enslaved people who were engaged in wage labor. Those forms are just very complicated. Once one's engaging with them at the level of the specificities that are engaged.
Thank you. Yeah, should I go?
Yeah, I think, Nick, we have your answer, and then we'll draw it to a close, I think, after that.
Okay, so Josie, thank you for your question. What I hear in your question is a shout out to Eric Williams and the argument that he put forward in Capitalism and Slavery, and that was so influential, that invented, in essence, this whole historiographic domain of capitalism and slavery. That book, among the many things it did, it forced an object of historiographic thought into existence, and it it was scandalous in so many ways. And one of the ways that it was most upsetting, not just of the moral good feelings of the English political class or something like that, it upset certain epistemological frameworks, and it invented this category, and it does indeed show. Of course, there's been much further historiographic work nuancing, developing, arguing with and against what Eric Williams first showed, but that argument that you summarized, that plantation slavery was a form of accumulation that kick-started capitalism with its accumulation of wealth, and I'm not arguing against that claim that Williams puts forward so strongly and with much good evidence. What I'm arguing against is in that book, and a tendency henceforth in the discussion to look simply at the accumulation of wealth as the key question, the key variable, when the question of, and simply to point out that wealth is a transhistorical category. If the problem is not slavery and the accumulation of wealth, the problem the title sets forth as an object of investigation, capitalism and slavery, then simply the accumulation of wealth, which obviously did occur, that this accumulation of wealth through command over unpaid labor, etc., kick-started capitalism. Yet it doesn't tell us about the nature of slavery within capitalism itself, because wealth is not a category limited to capitalism itself, just as command over unpaid labor isn't as well. The question about Sylvia Wynter, and I'm just curious. I don't have an answer because I haven't read her argument, which sounds fascinating. If I understand it correctly, that there comes to be a general equivalent, which is the life expectancy of a slave. I don't know. I find it. I'm maybe not saying it correctly. I have to read it. So thanks for pointing it out, and I don't have a good answer, but other than that, I look forward to it, and thank you for pointing me in that direction. And then Steve's question about the Grundrisse and that famous passage. there are a lot of things to say. One of the things that I'm very invested in what Peter called this formal perspective of thinking about social form in capitalism and slavery. More generally, I'm also very invested in thinking about the ways that Marx developed his argument. And for me, the Grundrisse constitutes his inquiry, constitutes his, not the only one, but the principle, those notebooks of beginning to work through the problem. And then he figures out how to systematically present the nature of that social form, right? He only, toward the very end, it's only at the end of the Grundrisse that he figures out, I have to start with value. Right, so I have to carry this back to the first chapter. Right, he's just working things out, and Heinrich makes a lot of this. That there are many of his most important conceptual distinctions, say between exchange value and value, that he hasn't thought through. There is no distinction, even in the first edition, 1867 of Volume 1. There's no distinction between exchange value and value. It's only in 1872, et cetera. So I'm really interested in thinking, let's say, genetically, constructively about what Marx is trying to do in his various iterations of capital, and the ways that he jettisons Hegelian logics. He develops what I'm calling Spinozist logics, like in chapter 11, in general. So that's one thing. I'm surprised to that you would think my argument Stalinist and stagist, and that the modes of production line up neatly in contrast to one another. I would, that's exactly what I've tried my best not to do, and to argue that we shouldn't think in terms of modes of production at all, that if we start thinking about modes of production again, without distinguishing what it is that Marx determines capital is a mode of producing, surplus value specifically, then we haven't reached we're stuck at about 1859 in his thought, and we haven't reached the determinations that he develops about what is capitalism. And so that for me, it's Eugene Genovese who says slavery is a different mode of production than capitalism. I'm by no means, I'm trying to argue just the opposite. And so then, just to finish, then I'm bringing up this case. I know Guadeloupe, Martinique, Haiti the best as historical cases, situations from my own background and work and thinking. I'm trying to bring some of these concepts. My conviction is that I'm very invested in archival work. I don't always have the time to go do it, but it's always been it's essential insofar as we can. But my conviction is that when we're confronted with mountains of documents, or some degree of that, we certainly see historical complexity. We see empirical complexity. And as Spinoza said, the problem with empiricism isn't that it's too simple, it's that it's too overwhelmingly complex, and that we need to approach the archive, we need to approach any historical case with theoretical means of thinking about what we're seeing and what we're finding. And if we don't, for example, have a working functional definition of capitalism as a social form, we can't even, I think, begin to think rigorously about what capitalist slavery is. And so, for me, anyway, it seems imperative that we construct the concepts we need to think about the problems we're facing. I've tried to describe one in this book, and to construct some concepts to address it, or to begin addressing it, such that we work in that direction, not from the sense impressions that we get from the complexity of the archive, and to invent explanations about what we're seeing there, but rather to construct the concepts and then to look into the case in the archive empirically as it may be, to think about what we find there, to have the means to do so, hopefully with some insight.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great closing statement, also in the way that it maybe speaks to more general questions, again, of method, of how do we do critical global theory, and so on. So thank you so much. We had an anonymous comment, which I think captures it quite well, and says, you have been working overtime, Nick, and we need to, maybe have a second or third iteration, because I was thinking, like, we haven't even touched on questions of universality and Spinoza and materialism and so on. But I think maybe for one day, it's enough. So thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions, for coming today. As Julia and Jacob put in the chat, the seminar series continues. So the next seminar in the series will be held on the 27th of March by Lucie Mercier on Frantz Fanon and the critical history of philosophy, and information on that will be sent out. If you are local to Goldsmiths, to London, Julia is organizing an event as well entitled Translating China, which takes place before that on the 25th of March, which is a Monday in Senate House. So please come along to that. Subscribe to our mailing list so that you will be hearing about all of this and reminded and so on, and have a look at the YouTube channel, where we will also upload the recording of the seminar. Thank you very much. So if all panelists would maybe stay on briefly while everyone else leaves. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for the questions.